Hello everyone, this is Rusty and welcome to another episode of How to Build in Minecraft. Today we're going to be discussing depth. We have three types of depth. We have back to front, left to right, and top to bottom. So this is really a perspective thing, and we're going to be playing around with this. So left to right depth is probably the easiest to create because if you don't have left to right depth, then you don't have a build really, because it's just a single block. Even if you add to this, right, by doing back to front depth, you still end up with a like no left to right depth, just a wall. So as we're building things, we want to keep this in mind. And one of the ways that practically is important is if you're making a wall, right, and we just make this really long wall like this in a build, like for a castle or something where we're just having a one wide wall, it doesn't look nearly as good as when we add in, say, oak planks going like this and maybe going like this, right? Now all of a sudden we've added a little bit of depth, a little bit of interest in the build. So when you're building things, you need to keep in mind all of the different aspects of depth, the top to bottom, left to right, and back to front of your depth. So let's pop over here and actually talk about what that looks like. So one of the interesting things about Minecraft versus traditional forms of painting or drawing art is that we have a three-dimensional space. Three-dimensional space means that when we talk about that three-dimensional depth, right, well, from here, our perspective says back to front, left to right, top to bottom. But over here, we have left to right, back to front, top to bottom, and this is just a different perspective. So all of a sudden, our left to right depth from this perspective becomes our back to front depth from this perspective. So if we take this side piece, for instance, and we say, okay, well, we've got a lot of back to front depth from here, but when we're over here, all of a sudden we don't have that back to front depth as much. We need to be considering as you're forming your build. This is why big builds are a lot more difficult to make than these smaller ones. You need to be considering from each side how all of that stuff is going to work. So in this case, the back to front depth is quite easy to see. We've got all of these different layers, which we'll talk about in the next episode, of dimensions. We've got the window, the stair, the eaves, then all these little decorational pieces that are under it, and the flower boxes and the flowers, and then of course the little pathway leading out to it. We've also got the back to front depth of the this little piece kind of sort of just coming out just a little bit, and so those are all the back to front depth. Again, if we move over to this side, that becomes left to right depth. So it adds the little bits of interest into the build on this side, and then we don't have anything on this side, but if we were to have like a shed or something, it would be on this side. Top to bottom depth is really illustrated kind of differently in a lot of these things. So for instance, we're looking at any time the plane changes, if you will. So for instance, we have top to bottom depth here by this sort of going down and then back up. We've got top to bottom depth in the fact that we aren't using regular blocks, we're using the stairs, right? Because if we do this, that changes the depth. We're able to add more top to bottom depth by adding these little bits of non-blocks. Same here, top to bottom depth, that we've got this going upwards, and then we've got some gaps, here. And then, of course, there's a lot of top to bottom depth as we go up. We have the back to front, but we've also got the top to bottom. So top to bottom is probably one of the more difficult ones to really see easily, but it kind of just makes itself. So don't worry too much about like what that's gonna look like and try and like say, oh, I need more top to bottom depth in this. One of the ways that I have learned actually pretty recently because I used to build boxes, right? I'd build a box and then I'd add little different pieces to add into the depth. And what I've learned more recently, and we'll get into this in another episode, is to actually plan out the build, plan out what you want to do, and part of that is adding in a main frame box. So in this case, it's the tallest part of the house, so to speak, and then add your little other parts and pieces. And basically what that does is on every single side, you should have either a shed, a little entrance area, a little back piece, something like this, like a back room, or a porch or something, or maybe even like a balcony, something on each side of your house that gives it a little extra character. So here with the front, we ended up doing just a little entryway, and it doesn't really change the way the build functionally on the inside works, right? It's the same as this, and that's intentional. I wanted to create that for this. But when we walk in, see, nothing's really changed. We've only changed really one block interior wise, but on the outside, it really changes the way this house is structured. So it went from this to this. It's a different feel. It feels more cozy. It feels more at home. The other thing we can do is create this A-frame roof, which is the most famous type of roof, I think, because a lot of us have A-frame roofs for our house. There are a bunch of other roofs, but I would stick for your first couple builds with the A-frame roof. And that basically just creates a nice eaves is where you want it. So take your end block here and then extend that by one, and that creates just a little bit of that back to front depth on this side, and of course on this side the left to right depth. So we've got a little bit of empty space here. So I wanted to just kind of throw out there too that in a way, some of the way that you put together your textures and the color changes your depth as well. So obviously we talked about this in textures, but your actual textures themselves have illusions of depth inside them. So the logs, for instance, and the cobblestone have their own depth. Okay, so I removed a little bit of this depth here to summarize in today's video what I want you guys to take away from this. There's no magic bullet to do this and this will create a bunch of depth. But there is sort of a formula that you can follow to figure out how to get a lot more depth in. And part of that is, one, practice, but two, the real formula is just to make sure that each side has some depth. And not just depth in the roof, but also saying, okay, well, what looks good here? What should I add here? If you've got something that's blank and there's not much going on in a build, then add something like this balcony, which I covered up apparently, or this little entryway. This would be a great spot for some windows, for instance. Just add things in and it will add a lot to the depth. And that's why I removed this here, is because I wanted to show you guys that you don't have to have all of the little detail-y parts and different things to make a build depthy. All you need to do is just add things like this, which bring the eye's interest that way, and then you'll see the little windows and that they're indented, and that just makes it feel cozy. You don't need to say every inch of the build needs to have little pieces of depth, but just adding a window can create a lot of depth. Okay, so the exercise for this week is going to be create a small house and use some depth like we talked about. And think about those three layers, the back to front, left to right, and top to bottom, and just, play around with different things. So next week, we will talk about layering, and we'll talk about how to add in these little depthy parts, and what that looks like on the inside, the outside, and really environmental layering as well. So lots to cover in that episode, but that is going to do it for today's episode. Love to hear your guys' feedback in the comment section below. And of course, leave a like on the video if you did enjoy. And if you really enjoyed, consider hitting that subscribe button. But until next time, guys, happy mining and crafting.